Welcome to tonight's webinar on business adaptation and resilience during COVID-19. This is part of the University of the Sunshine Coast Research Unmasked seminar series. I'm Dr. Gemma Reid and I'm one of the organisers of this series, and the aim is really to provide some information about research and expertise by our academics at USC on topics related to COVID-19. On behalf of all of us participating in this session today, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands and waters upon which the university's campuses are located. I acknowledge their continuing connections to country, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I recognise that these lands have always been places of learning and teaching for Indigenous peoples. In just a moment, I'll hand you over to our session facilitator, Professor Laurel Fraser. Before I do, I just wanted to mention a couple of things about how the session will run tonight. So for those of you who might have been in the sessions already, we'll be using the Q&A function in Zoom to ask questions. So you'll be able to find that as a button near the bottom of your screen, and you'll be able to type in your questions. We'll be asking the questions after all the presenters have spoken. And you won't necessarily see the questions coming through while people are talking, but you will start to see them come through at the end as they're being answered. So I would encourage you to ask questions during the session, and then we'll answer them towards the end. There is an option to ask your question anonymously if you'd prefer to do that as well. So the other thing I just wanted to let you know is that you might hear an audible tone during the presentations. This is really just a timekeeping device to try and keep everyone to time so that we can get to all the questions at the end. So now it's my pleasure to hand you over to our session facilitator, Professor Laurel Fraser. Laurel is the Dean and Head of USC's School of Business and Creative Industries. Laurel's research has spanned franchising, small business and entrepreneurship. She's regarded as one of the country's leading franchising experts and has received the Contribution to Franchising Award from the Franchise Council of Australia for her contributions to the area. Laurel has also served on several national and international boards and committees. So Laurel, I'd like to ask you to come onto video, and I'll hand over to you for to take us through the rest of the session. Thank you.
Thanks, Gemma, and welcome everyone to Research Unmasked. In tonight's webinar, we're going to focus on business adaptation and resilience during COVID-19. And I think you'll agree, it's been a really interesting year. At USC, we're very fortunate in being located on the Sunshine Coast for obvious reasons, but also because Queensland has managed the pandemic very well. And then just as Victoria emerged from lockdown this week, we heard that England plunged into another lockdown along with other European nations. So there's no doubt that the pandemic has resulted in extreme pressure on health and the global economy. But tonight, we shine a light on the way that some businesses have adapted to these extraordinary circumstances. So we have 4 researchers presenting aspects of their work which highlight how businesses have managed disruption this year and how they have discovered new opportunities for innovation during COVID-19. As Gemma said, at the end of the presentations, there'll be time to answer any questions that you post during the webinar, so please do so. But I think we'll get started, and it's my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Rietta Scheepers. Rietta is a senior lecturer in entrepreneurship and innovation at USC. Her areas of research and expertise include lean startup, customer development, entrepreneurship, innovation management, and information technology as drivers of innovation in small businesses. Rietta has led various initiatives to support startups, including volunteering with the Sunshine Coast startup community. In recognition of her community engagement activities, Rietta was awarded USC's Vice Chancellor and President's Award for Excellence in Engagement in 2015. Rietta's presentation is about how businesses responded to the COVID-19 crisis with resilience by adapting and innovating. So I'll hand it over to you now, Rietta.
Thank you, Laurel, and thank you, Gemma. I'm very excited to share some of our findings with everyone because we were quite puzzled and perplexed when the pandemic started to know how businesses should react and how they would react and be resilient during challenging times. And we embarked on this project in collaboration with Innovate Moreton Bay And also on the team is Dr. Noel Tracy and Ines Mani. So in our project, what we set out to do was to specifically focus on small business. There's been a lot of research done on large businesses and crisis management, but actually very little on small businesses. And of course, the pandemic is really an unknown event that we're living through. So we looked at resilience as how do businesses respond to the pandemic and how these responses set them up to survive and thrive post-pandemic. So we interviewed 20 businesses in Southeast Queensland, really looking at diverse industries, not just one industries, and also businesses that serve both business to business customers and business to government as half of our sample, and those that serve end users in all these different areas that you see represented over here, from software to professional services to food and agribusinesses, manufacturing, because we really wanted to get a broad range. And so before I kind of get to the findings, I'd like to first just tell you about two cases that represent the sort of responses that I'll talk about. First, meet Mandy Schultz from Loverberry. Now, Loverberry is a family-owned strawberry farm in Wamuran and is operated by Mandy and her husband, Adrian. And really, Mandy has a reputation for thinking differently, because since 2017, she's had this war on waste, because strawberry waste often gets thrown away. And she's decided that that shouldn't be the industry standard for their farm. And she's turned strawberries into all kind of value-added products like freezing strawberries and using them in jams and cooking and working with chocolate makers to turn them into chocolates. Just really quite innovative in that sense. And she's developed a strong online community. She sold to them directly and would go and deliver strawberries all over Southeast Queensland. And then she and her husband decided to diversify the farm and grow finger limes and also herbs. And finger limes is quite a speciality product. And they were all set. They had an export buyer lined up. And when the COVID pandemic hit, the exporter just cancelled their contract, and that part of their business was totally decimated. And in fact, she couldn't sell the strawberries in the way she had before. But as Mandy says in her own words, farmers are quite resilient. They live through drought, they live through hail. They made it through the needle pandemic or scandal of 2018. So here comes Mandy, and she starts an online shop on her website called Farmgate. And Farmgate has people coming all over to come and buy fresh produce, and she works with other farmers in the area, and they collect their fresh produce at the Farmgate. And what Mandy realized is she was getting a lot of day trippers, so she introduced a new experience called peckish picking, where anybody can come along and bring their family, and she controlled that according to the health guidelines. And she realized people were making a day trip of it, so she added to her website a lot of other experiences that day trippers could undertake. Not the sort of typical thing that you would think of a farming business really tends to do, that produce quite a lot of things. So another case study I'd like to share with you is Justin. Justin is the franchise owner of World Gym in Burpengary. And this is a really big gym. They've got 4,300 members. Before COVID hit, they were offering more than 150 classes a week, ranging from Pilates, yoga, athletics, even doing some remediary work and so forth. So the gym was a hustling and bustling heap of activity. And then, of course, when the government mandate announced that all gyms should close at the 23rd of March to the 1st of June, and all payments should be stopped, Justin, like many other gym owners, just had to follow the official guidelines, and he could only retain 6 of the 20 staff that he had on JobKeeper. And this is sort of enough to make anybody go, well, you know, maybe I should just take a holiday for a couple of months, but that's not what Justin did. In fact, he started a new business in the middle of the pandemic called Raw Power Meals. And it was an idea that he was sort of working on before, but this has got nutritionally based home delivered meals, and they are targeted for the specific health goals that people try to achieve when they often join a gym, such as muscle gain or gluten-free meals, weight loss, and so forth. So a whole range. And in fact, within a month of launching this raw power meals, their kitchen was at capacity. They now deliver across Queensland, and they're planning to expand in January when they can find a bigger facility. So totally, I guess, beating the trend there, what we see. So in our findings, there's a couple of things that I'd like to draw out. Firstly, a couple of general observations. Industry matters. So we spoke to 20 businesses, and businesses in the tourism industry are affected quite differently than people in health and fitness and those that deliver business-to-business services. So when we compare these different firms, we really needed to take that into account. The other thing is the age of the firm matters too. So firms that are younger and less experienced, or less history and less resources, are actually more likely to adapt and change more quickly than those that have been established for longer. And then we also could see a clear difference between if the owners or the founders had previous business or entrepreneurial experience, because they had mental models to draw from to think about how they might respond to the pandemic. So in terms of the responses, we really at this stage, we've sort of divided into three main categories. Those that go through adaptation, so businesses, and this is the majority of the businesses we interviewed, around 60% of them, are really changing what they do to serve the customer. And a really simple example that's probably in everybody's experience is a restaurant that was a sit-down venue that then changes to take-away meals. They still are serving their customers, but they are doing it in a different way to what they were doing it before. In terms of the innovation, the example of raw power meals shows how a totally new business can be started, or how something that's a silver lining can be seen as an opportunity by a business owner. So in our study, we actually talked to a couple of business owners who have seized opportunities in health, in hygiene, in people now living online and in learning online. And then the group of businesses that we're most worried about are the ones that have a survive response. So these sort of businesses are almost paralyzed by the changes. They've almost gone to a wait and see, and they're waiting for things to go back to 2019 normal. And the biggest worry there is that things might never go back to that. And while they have been waiting for things to go back to normal, their rivals have tried new things, innovated, learned new skills, and will be using that to compete in 2021. So what can you learn from this? If you're a business owner, leadership is critical. The clients, the employees, all the suppliers look to the business owner for leadership. So it's important to provide the direction on going forward. The businesses that adapted and innovated have an obsessive focus on customers. So they think about what is the value is that they're providing to the customer and change their operations around that. Those that innovated amidst the pandemic, this is kind of a common theme, is they said, innovation is not about perfection. It's about learning, it's about experimenting, and about improving. And a lot of their customers were quite patient with them to innovate through the pandemic and not necessarily expect a perfect result. And finally, community is super important. So all of these businesses that we talked to that were innovating and adapting, we're talking about how important it is to buy local, support other locals, elevate other businesses. So what we see from this is small businesses don't just play an economic role in community, they really form part of the social fabric and the lifeblood of a community. And that's really the way we should be seeing them in a crisis. So that's highlights from our talk. I believe we have an opportunity for Q&A later. Thanks, Loretta.
Thanks, Rieta. Excellent timing there. But some great stories to back up your research. And it's really interesting to hear how small businesses have adapted really quickly to the changing environment, especially if they've embraced innovation, even during lockdowns. And thanks for including a franchise amongst your case studies. Okay, so look, we've received a few questions via chat, but we'll hold these over until all the presentations have been completed. But remember that you can send your questions through at any time. There's no need to wait until the end. But I'd like to introduce our second speaker now, Dr. Karen Sutherland. So Karen is a lecturer in public relations at USC, and she's coordinator for the Bachelor of Creative Industries social media program. She has over 20 years industry experience in marketing, public relations and communication roles for organisations such as ABC TV, Fremantle Media and the Australian Red Cross Blood Service. Karen is dedicated to demystifying the technology for local business and community and non-profits. Her work has been published widely in peer-reviewed journals, and she is currently finalising a book on social media management, which is due for release later this year. So let's look out for that. Now, Karen's presentation will focus on social media tactics that can be used to support businesses throughout COVID-19. So please go ahead, Karen.
Thank you. Okay, so during COVID-19 pandemic, particularly during the lockdown, this is where I did some research focusing on how businesses were responding and particularly how they were using social media. And so what I found is there were three key things that came out of that research. Firstly, they adapted, and the way that Rhiannon spoke about with her research, it was very clear that was a really firm focus. Next, they use social media to really engage and build and strengthen their relationships with their customers. They built community and strengthened that community. So many of them already had a strong community, and then they doubled down on that to keep people engaged when they couldn't actually come in face-to-face into their stores. And then they also prepared. They were there and they were ready for when the lockdown or the restrictions changed. They were ready. And so I'm going to delve into each of these sort of areas a little bit more. In terms of adapting, I also have a couple of examples, of local examples here on the Sunshine Coast. So one was also a gym, a CrossFit gym called CrossFit Cooltown. And what I really admired about the way they responded to COVID was that they'd already understood the importance of building a community on social media around their brand. And so their members were already part of a really active, thriving, positive Facebook group. And so when they were already connected with them and highly engaged. So what would happen is when there was a media conference and the new restrictions were announced, they were in that group communicating what their plans were going to be to their members pretty much within minutes of that going down. So they had already sat back and thought about how they were going to respond and were ready. And so what happened when the gym had to be shut for a number of weeks, they then provided Zoom workouts for their members during that time. And they also allowed their equipment to be lent out like a library, but fully sanitized, of course, so that their members could actually, still work out at home. So they put themselves in their customers' shoes and really understood from their perspectives how they could still service their customers during that time. The other local business that has done amazing things as a result of COVID was an event management company at the time called White House Celebrations. And so they were an event management company that would put on like huge charity galas, like really big events on the coast. And clearly when the restrictions came, that had to stop. So they were left and thinking, how are we going to survive in this climate? But what they did is they then pivoted, to use a very overused term, and decided to deliver online events. And so they really specialized and built their skills in that very quickly and adapted very quickly and started delivering these really great online events. And now they've actually just expanded and rebranded, and now they're called White House International, because now they can provide their services to people all around the world, because they deliver both on face-to-face events as well as online events. So they've actually come out of COVID in a much better position based on the way that they innovated during that time, or they had to innovate. As I mentioned about using social media to engage with the community. So businesses generally, what they did, the ones that did it really well, they created really helpful content to guide their customers or their followers through the pandemic in terms of how they could actually cope with it. And a couple of times a year, there's research done called the Edelman Trust Barometer. And so they did one around the time of COVID. They surveyed 12,000 people, and it's all around sort of trust placed in organisations. And so you can see here the statistic that 84% of respondents said that this is actually what they wanted. They didn't want brands to advertise to them. They wanted them to help them and provide helpful advice around what they can do to actually cope and navigate the new situation and the new environment. The third approach that businesses that functioned really well during COVID was this preparation. So they couldn't really forecast exactly what was going to happen. However, they were ready in terms of having some sort of marketing communication strategy to relaunch after the pandemic. So some of the details, of course, had to change in line with the restrictions, but they had a plan there and they were ready to go. They knew, the fundamental things that they had to do, who they had to communicate to, what they had to communicate, how they were going to do it. They were all ready to go for when things changed again. And so because of that, like I'm often asked, because on social media, as you would know, during COVID, the amount of content that was going, there's always a lot of content, but during that time, people were home, they were sharing misinformation, disinformation around the pandemic, and there were businesses just advertising so many things. And I was often asked, how can businesses cut through and reach the people they need to? And so I thought I would spend part of my presentation explaining, just some tactics that businesses can use to do that. And so the most important thing is to really understand your audience. And that's, the first rule of communication is understanding your audience and not trying to speak to absolutely everyone, because if you're trying to speak to everyone, you won't actually connect with anyone. So it's really understanding who your customers are, and there'll be little subgroups within that customer base, and crafting different communication for each of those different groups, and understanding the social media platforms that you're using. So it's really not recommended to write or create the same content and just blast it out on every single platform in exactly the same way. It's really understanding the nuances and characteristics of each social media platform. And then, you can use the base content, but you need to tweak it to suit the characteristics of each platform, because that way you will reach more people by actually really leveraging those different characteristics. Visual elements of content is also really important. So video and images that are very sort of vivid in their colouring, because you're trying to grab attention when people are just scrolling on their phones. So it's really important to think about how you're going to do that, and making sure that the visual aspect of it is something that's going to make people want to stop and actually look at it. And also, beginning content with some sort of question that you are commonly asked, that just shows that you really understand the people you're trying to connect with, or even sort of thinking about a barrier that may be preventing a particular group from engaging with your business, and then providing reasons why that really isn't a barrier. That's a really good way to show that you understand your customers and who you're trying to connect with. Another good thing, while I said don't advertise, there are some really great sort of targeting capabilities on some of the platforms, particularly on Facebook and Instagram, where you can really, it's good and it's bad, because you can actually really target particular groups of people around your brand. So it helps to get your content in front of them. It doesn't necessarily mean that you are pushing a product and saying buy, but you could be creating helpful content for them, and it just helps you to actually get through that. and get in front of them. Facebook in particular has reduced organic reach so much. I mean, in 2012, I think it was around 16% of people who liked your page would actually see your content organically. Now it's down to about 6%. So clearly the platforms want you to spend money to, I guess, amplify your messages in that way. So it is a good thing to consider, and you don't need a huge budget either. The other thing is, building an email list by offering something of value. It could be a report or some sort of helpful bit of information that people are happy to sign up for, and then you can target your communication to them, and just sharing that helpful content, and it helps to build your credibility. Sharing general advice is really recommended on social media, and people will then come to you and pay you for more customized advice. And again, keep building those relationships with your customers even after they purchase, and consider really building that community in Facebook groups or whatever platform, just so if things like this happen, you already have that highly engaged community with who will stick with you when situations arise like we had this year. So thank you very much. If you want to connect with me, please feel free. And yeah, I'm on pretty much anything, on all social media, so feel free to reach out if you have any other questions after tonight's presentation.
Thanks so much for your presentation, and you've given some really practical and useful ideas about how businesses can maximise their use of social media during the pandemic. And a quick observation that I had from both your presentation and Rietta's is how proactive gyms were in responding to the pandemic, because gymnasiums suffered quite badly during the lockdown, but it's amazing how agile they were and how they stepped up really quickly to keep in touch with their clients. So yeah, that was good. So just a reminder once again that you can post questions via the chat, and we'll address them following the next two presentations, which are going to be done jointly. So I'd like to introduce our final two speakers. We have Professor Paul Salmon, and Paul is a Professor of Human Factors and Director of USC's Centre for Human Factors and Socio-Technical Systems. Paul uses human factors and systems thinking methods to understand and optimise human, team, organisational and system performance. His work has spanned transport safety, defence, workplace safety, emergency management, cybersecurity, and even sport and outdoor education. He has co-authored numerous books and peer-reviewed journal articles, and has received prestigious international awards for his work, including from the British Aeronautical Society and the Chartered Institute of Ergonomics and Human Factors. And joining Paul will be Dr. Scott McLean. And Scott is a research fellow in USC's Centre for Human Factors and Socio-Technical Systems. He has a background in exercise science and a PhD in human factors in sport. Last year, Scott was presented with the David Ferguson Award for Best Postgraduate Thesis by the Human Factors and Ergonomics Society of Australia. His main areas of expertise and interest include performance analysis, teamwork assessment, systems thinking, and coaching science, and he has conducted research projects with the Sunshine Coast Lightning, Brisbane Roar, and the St Kilda Football Club. So tonight, Paul and Scott will be speaking about the use of systems thinking to optimise organisational design, and they'll include a case study of the work that they've completed with the St Kilda Football Club. So take it away, please, Paul and Scott.
Thank you, Laurel. Thank you also to Gemma for the invitation to speak. So what I'm going to do in my kind of half of the presentation is quickly introduce just a couple of sets of principles for work design, and I guess these are the principles that we use to help the AFL club in redesigning their organisation in the response to COVID-19, and I guess we're kind of recommending that other organisations could use a similar approach. So the first one that I want to talk about is socio-technical systems theory, and socio-technical, all that means basically is people and tools who are working together in a system towards a shared goal. So basically any kind of work organization. And the reason there's a coal mine on the slide there is that this is a theory that was developed in the 1950s by Eric Trist and Ken Banforth in the UK in response to the fact that they'd introduced new technologies into mines. And so they'd introduced this great big machine, which was called the longwall mining method, which replaced the hand kind of coal mining method. And this kind of group were really interested in what the social and psychological consequences of introducing new technologies into the work system were. And so they did some really interesting studies in the mines. And what they really found was the mechanization, so the introduction of technology, although it really increased efficiency, it kind of destroyed morale in the workforce. It created issues with the workers. The workers were no longer fully understood the work, and so on and so forth. So they created a whole approach to actually optimize work design. And I'll touch on a couple of the key principles. So what the socio-technical system design approach does is give you a set of key principles that you can kind of use to optimize your work. And they're very focused on making sure that there's joint optimization between humans and technologies within your work, and really that the human worker gets a good experience out of working for you, and that you optimize your work processes. And so some of them just on the slide there, for example, are multi-skilling. So this idea that your workers will be multi-skilled rather than having just individual skills focused on one particular task. They're actually multi-skilled to focus on a lot of them. Variety and meaning, in this idea that the work tasks that you give to people in your organization have variety and they have meaning to the people. The work is rewarding. Teams is an obvious one, this idea that we emphasize teams rather than individual workers. And then some more interesting ones like incompletion, where you kind of say, well, the work process is never finished. We're continually redesigning our work. And so they give you quite interesting principles that Scott will touch on a bit more, I think. And just to kind of get across in a review of, so this has been applied in many areas to design work processes, and there was a great big review of 134 studies, I think. And basically what they found was the studies that had looked at this had found 87% of those studies had found increased productivity, increased safety in 88%, more positive worker attitudes in 94%, reductions in absenteeism in 81% of the studies, and an increase in the quality of work in 97% of the studies. So the approach is really shown to work. The second kind of point that I just want to touch on briefly before handing over to Scott is this idea of leverage points. So when you're thinking about redesigning your work system, is think about leverage points in your system. And these are basically places where you can make small changes and they have huge positive effects. And so I've just, again, there's 12 of these, and I would suggest going to DanellaMeadows.org to look at the 12. I've just picked out 4 that I wanted to touch on briefly. So the first one is the goals of the system. So the goals of your organization obviously have a very powerful influence on behavior. And so, for example, with COVID, we've seen numerous times where if the goal of a lockdown system and easing of lockdown is around the economy, it's going to have a bad effect on the suppression of the virus because the economy is focused on. The rules of the system is really interesting. They define the scope of the system, its boundaries, what can be done in the system. And so when people are all redesigning work, we always tell them to think of the rules of your system. Often it's useful to flip the rules and see what actually, see what changes could potentially happen. And we saw this in COVID, for example. We saw, we've already mentioned restaurants doing takeaway. People were allowed to work remotely far more often. Travel was eliminated, for example, at USC. So you start to change the rules of the system and you get very big changes on behavior. System structure is basically modifying your system structure, so adding new structures in terms of things like technologies, new processes. And a key example of this is obviously Zoom. Once people added Zoom to their organization, they could do very different things in terms of remote meetings, remote work, remote learning, and things like that. And then the final one is information flow. So really, when you're redesigning your work, really think about who has access to information in your organization, who should have access to information, and how can you increase the information that people have access to. And what we found in our studies really that if you are making organizational change, it's really important to give a lot of information out about why you're doing it and what the changes are going to be. And we found that the more you explain the organizational change, the better the workers respond to that. So there's some key principles, and we kind of tried to apply these in the study. So what I'm going to do now is hand over to Scott to take over.
Great. All right. So yeah, thanks, Paul, and thanks to Laurel. Yeah. So for the next few minutes, I'll just talk about how the case study that we did with the redesign of the St Kilda Football Department. So there's a couple of images here that a really good indication of the impact COVID has had on elite sport, obviously with the empty stadiums. So the professional sporting industry was hit hard financially by COVID-19. So organisations and clubs were not able to sell tickets, broadcasting revenue was slashed, no merchandise sales. And also many of these big elite clubs have numerous staff, so in the hundreds of staff, and there's been large-scale job losses. And most sadly, my club, Arsenal Football Club, had to cut their mascot, Gunnosaurus, due to the financial constraints. But seriously, so a successful and sustainable return to sport will require some extensive modifications. So the aim of the study was to apply some of the principles that Paul's mentioned to analyse the current functioning of St Kilda's football department. And within this, to model and evaluate the current football department, and then also to identify some potential modifications to the club's operations. So I don't want to spook anybody here, and I don't expect anyone to follow this model, but this is the complex systems model of the St Kilda Football Club department. So what I wanted to highlight here is just the sheer complexity of it. So the components and all the interactions between the components. So the way that we did this, we modeled it across 5 different levels. So the purpose or the goals of the actual system, how the St Kilda Club was actually measuring whether these purposes or goals were being achieved, the functions that were required to be performed to reach the purposes. And then if we skip to the bottom, so the physical objects within the system, and then the affordances of what the physical objects allow to do. So a second phase of the project was to identify the system's actors, so all of the staff within the football department. So what we wanted to do here was use these group of actors with the previous slide model, and sort of within that, so who or what currently does what, or who or what could do what, and that's especially important when you're looking to sort of cut funding and maybe move people on if that's necessary. So without going into detail, we performed a detailed systems analyses and to provide recommendations to redesign the football department system. So the first thing I want to say is obviously it's quite complex, but and the point I'm trying to get across is to embrace that complexity. So this is one of my favorite quotes, and it talks about how you cannot study a system by studying the parts in isolation. And it's the goodness and the richness of the analysis is the interaction between the parts that shapes the system behavior. So too often we're sort of focused on, fixing a single broken component of isolating, one thing and looking at that without understanding the full system impact that will have on the rest of the system. There's another little picture that I like here is this fella sitting on the chair here was trapped in, so he wanted to make himself some more space, but without knowing what the full system behavior was doing, he's going to cause himself a lot of trouble down the track. So, the benefits of embracing this complexity is you get a full understanding of the multiple interacting factors that influence the behavior of the system. It tells us how the system is functioning. It also identifies a diverse set of actors who share responsibility for the performance of the system. It identifies redundancy, so where there's many supporting resources to the components, or fragilities also to show that lack of resources to certain components as well. So what do we learn and what do we pass on to the St Kilda Football Club through all this? Potentially that they were seeking the wrong goals, that the system goals were not supported by the functioning of the system. And we probably wouldn't have been able to tell this unless we modeled the system as thoroughly and as sort of complexly as we did. We also found that a lot of the measures they had that were measuring the progress towards that goal were actually either not being measured objectively, or they didn't have actual measures for them. Or another case was that they had a large emphasis on winning matches when, for example, some of their other goals may have been to develop culture or diversity within the club. They had less sort of measures assessing if those things were trying to happen. And also, this one is quite common in sports organisations. It's a specialist versus generalist type thing. So in a sporting organisation, you'll have your nutritionist, your match analyst, your physio. And you saw by the list of actors that we had up earlier, it's a very specialised staff. So one of the things that we sort of recommended to them was to have more of a generalist staff. So you've got people that can do multiple roles, and especially if you're looking to reduce staff numbers, you're going to need sort of a more generalist. And as Paul talked about, there's more job satisfaction less days off work and all those types of benefits that come with it. So yeah, so the system had a large specialised staff, but also that can create this siloed effect where there's not information flow. So Paul also mentioned about information flow through the system. So a specialised staff can also, you know, restrict that. And just a couple more. So overlapping of functionality of objects was another one that we identified, and this was mainly around the technology aids they had. So match performance analysis and a bunch of other sort of tech aids. And I think a lot of this is due to the competitiveness of sport. So a new product will come on the market and it's like, right, we've got to have that because our competitors might have that. However, you end up with a bunch of sort of tools that are all doing relatively the same thing. So, and again, we wouldn't have identified these types of things had we not modeled the entire system. And just the last thing I wanted to touch on was that we started to do this work with St Kilda sort of prior before the competition, the AFL competition moved up to Queensland, and then the St Kilda became based up here in Noosa. And so a lot of the things that we recommended to them, because they come up here with this sort of skeleton staff, was it was sort of forced onto them. So they had to probably be more generalists. Yeah, I mean, we haven't caught up with them post-season yet, so we don't actually know what's happened, but we're sort of guessing that a lot of these things were forced upon them. And I guess it's a message there for business. If your business is, or organisation is not performing as it probably should or as it could, you know, it takes a brave sort of step to fully change the system or change the goals of the system. But this was forced upon them, and you know, there was no real harm done, and they ended up having sort of the best season in 10 years. So take the jump, I suppose, is the message if it's not working properly. And I think that's me. Oh, and I sorry, just had a quote from the Simon Ledland, the Chief Operating Officer, that they were quite impressed with the work that we did, and that it's going to have an impact on them as they move forward. So pleasing comments to receive. And that's me. So thanks very much.
Excellent. So thanks, Paul and Scott, both for your presentations. Paul in particular for explaining the role of socio-technical system design in the workplace and how it improves the outputs, and Scott, the St Kilda Football Club case study puts everything into perspective, and somehow I think you really enjoyed doing that case study. I think what we can look from the 4 presentations that we've had is it's been really interesting to see that, you know, while most organisations have had to focus on just keeping their heads above water this year, the pandemic has sparked innovation and quick adaptation in some other businesses, and that's what this was all about tonight, to explore those areas. So, and you've all kept to time very nicely, which is great. So we've got time now for some Q&A. So could all the speakers please turn your cameras on again? And I'll just get the questions. All right, so the first one is actually for Rieta. So the question is, you mentioned that businesses innovate their business models. What do you mean by that? And can you give an example?
Yeah, thanks, Laurel. So when we talk about a business model, we're really thinking of these, I guess has some links to what Paul and Scott was talking about, how a business is this complex set of different parts that interact together. So we think of the value creation part that's targeted at the customer, the front end. Often what we see is products and services getting delivered. Then there's a backstage that we often don't see, how that value gets delivered, and then how the financial model actually supports that. So if I'll just go back to the case that I used about the raw power meals, there we see them still satisfying customers' health needs, but in a very different way. They've gone and they've used kind of focusing on the nutritional component. They need a whole back-end different system to do that, setting up a kitchen and a delivery and almost a logistics system, which is quite different from what they were doing before in doing the gym. And in that sense, they've created new revenue drivers that actually strengthens their business model to be a little bit more balanced and diverse for when other crises hit, or like you mentioned, Laurel, there, you know, second waves are still a possibility. So it kind of sets them up to be more resilient in future.
Yeah, thanks, Rieta. All right, this question's clearly going to be for Karen. Karen, how can businesses without any or a very limited advertising budget make the most of social media?
Okay, it's easier said than done, but trying to create content that people want to interact with, because the more that people interact with a piece of content, particularly within the first hour of it being posted, which is why scheduling at the right time when most of your audience is online is so important. It means that the platforms then see it as valuable, and they will show it to more people. So creating things that people will want to share, which is the highest form of engagement, and or even just liking and commenting can really help. So even if you gave, what I've seen really working well lately is like a giveaway. So it's not going to cost you too much. It's something you can afford to give away, and asking people to comment or something like that, to interact with that piece of content that's promoting that giveaway, that can help to get your message out in front and promote your business in that particular way. So yeah, so it's really doing that. And video is still the most shared type of content on social media. So really learning how to create some really great video, and you don't have to have a huge budget or production values now. You can create it with your smartphone. It's about being human, like what we're doing tonight on Zoom, and showing yourself and just creating stuff that you think people will want to know about you and your business.
And it's not just the younger generation who can do that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Thanks, Karen. Okay, this one I think might be best for Scott. Without being trained in complexity or systems thinking, how can business owners or managers go about modelling their own business processes?
Yeah, thanks. It's a good question. I guess there's two approaches. I mean, there's a top-down approach where you can start with the goals and possibly, work downwards to what the functioning of the system is going to look like. Or there's the bottom-up approach. So you could probably, what have we got, and how can we work upwards, to the functioning of the system to achieve the goals that we've got. So for me, it's all about understanding what the goals of the system are, and then sort of structuring your business to work with that. I mean, in terms of the fancy modeling that we use is not necessary either. I mean, it can be just pen and paper or whiteboard, and just work through it that way. But there's a classic saying in systems thinking that the system, will produce the exact results that the system is set up to, as a system set up structure. So, if you're not achieving the results that you want or the goals that you got, then it's a structural problem, and then you might need to dig in around the structure. But I don't know, hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, I think it did, Scott. Thanks very much. Another one for Rieta here. How can small business owners adapt to a world that is more digital and online if they don't have the skills needed for this?
Well, I think Karen started to share some tips there. So I guess one big thing that we saw with all our case studies is this rapid adoption of digital. We have the majority of small business owners actually being 45 years and older, and often starting a business in what we say technical area that they might be particularly good with, so they don't necessarily have the sort of background business skills, and then they find themselves, they can't just take out a ad in the local paper anymore. That's not, papers are now digital, and they really have to step up. So we've seen a big shift in this study that we've done and other research as well. And what I would say is I'd approach that as I would approach any innovation. Why don't you just try something, for example, that Karen has suggested? Try to say, what's going to be something engaging that I can share or ask people to vote for? A simple yes or a no on a post can be really powerful way to get that engagement. Have a look at how that goes, and then learn from that. Next time you have a better idea, well, that kind of worked in that way, so now I can do something else. So instead of trying to have like a perfect campaign, just try something really small, test it, see what you learn from that, and then try the next thing. So don't try to be Coca-Cola when you're starting out. You have to try something that just fits and that you feel is achievable.
Yeah, incremental, and just give it a go. Good.
The Australian way.
Yeah, that's right. I love this question. It's for you, Karen. Without naming any names, what is one of the biggest mistakes you've seen in businesses using social media?
I guess sharing information without checking if it's true, that would be one of the worst things I've seen. And I guess it's also, I guess, responding to complaints in a negative way as well. So, and because that can just exacerbate it. So it's important to respond and see it as an opportunity to try and turn it around rather than come in and be really defensive. So there's some great resources online about really positive ways to respond to complaints. So I think that's probably the worst thing. It's people sort of, they're not responding in a sort of a calm way. They're reacting, and that can just make the situation worse. As you can see, things travel very fast and far on social media. So yeah,
I think we've all fallen into that trap of believing it when we read it instead of checking. Yeah, but you learn, don't you? Okay, here's one for Scott. How do you think the club moving to Noosa for the Sunshine Coast COVID hub may have hindered or helped the club?
Oh, another good question. I don't have any objective data, but I would say that it forced them into, so for example, when we talked about on my presentation before about the modelling, that there was a lot of it was focused on winning, but less resources directed towards probably culture, I'd say, or togetherness or some cohesive groupness. I'd say maybe being together 24/7 maybe created those factors as well, and that was forced upon them. It's been, I can't say for sure, but that'd be one thing I'd just say off the top of my head. Maybe Paul's got some comment around that as well.
Yeah, that's a great question. I wonder as well, and I think Scott and I have chatted about this, whether part of it is related to the idea of multi-skilling. So the fact that they couldn't bring their entire cohort of staff to the Sunshine Coast meant that they brought a very small group of people who could fulfill a number of roles. And I think part of the work design process that I was talking about is that's really critical. If you've got people who can perform multiple roles, they're working better, they're happier, and that kind of passes on to everybody, and it would have passed on to the player staff. They wouldn't have been, if you like, handed around to lots of individuals to manage them and their fitness and their form and things like that. There would have been a very small team, all kind of in it together, as Scott says, multi-skilled staff, and yeah, it would have had lots of positive benefits, I suspect. Like Scott said, we've got no objective data though.
Good. And while you're there, Paul, actually, and this will have to be our last question because we're nearly out of time, but this came up during your presentation. You spoke about principles for redesigning to improve employee outcomes. Can you use the same principles to improve the customer experience?
That's a really good question. I've never been asked that before. I suspect you probably can. I suspect it depends on what kind of business you are and what your customers are actually doing, but I think most of them will probably work nicely in that context. It's certainly worth trying, that's for sure.
Excellent. Well, our time is up, so I'm going to bring the webinar to a close. Firstly, I'd like to thank our presenters very much, Dr. Rietta Sheepers, Dr. Karen Sutherland, Professor Paul Salmon, and Dr. Scott McLean. And thanks also to those of you who attended the webinar and for your thoughtful questions tonight. This was the 4th webinar in our Research Unmasked series, and you might also like to tune into the final one next week, which explores the societal implications of COVID-19. So I think that'll be really interesting. So thank you, everyone, and good night.